Welcome to all of our Becoming Your Best podcast listeners, wherever you may be in the world today. This is Steve Schallenberger, your host, and we have a wonderful guest with us today with an amazing subject. So we're looking forward to this. I have personally, it's going to be a great takeaway for all of you who are listening. Thank you for tuning in. We love that. So as we introduce this guest today, she is a speaker, facilitator, author, and empathy advocate who believes cash flow, creativity, and compassion are not mutually exclusive. And she spent decades helping forward-thinking leaders and teams connect and engage through empathy to accelerate growth and impact. So we are so grateful to have with us today Maria Ross. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you, Steve. So glad to be here.
Okay, well, I'd like to tell you just a little bit more about Maria before we launch into our interview. She's authored multiple books, including her newest book, The Empathy Dilemma: How Successful Leaders Balance Performance, People, and Personal Boundaries. Her previous book, The Empathy Edge, sparked a movement, and she now hosts the top-rated The Empathy Edge podcast, speaking with leaders, change makers, authors, activists, and how to achieve radical success through empathy. Well, these are amazing accomplishments. Way to go.
Thank you.
Oh, that's good. She delivers powerful talks and leadership training for companies such as Salesforce, New York Life, and a host of others. We love having her here. She's been a 10X speaker. So before we jump into this today, let's just talk about your background. Share with us any really significant events that have had a big impact in your life and help you to get where you're at today.
Wow. So I began my career as a management consultant in a big six firm, and then quickly got back to my love of marketing, working in both the client and agency sides, working for companies like Discovery Networks, and eventually working at an advertising agency where one of my clients was Monster.com. Learned a lot about the breadth of marketing. And then in 1999, got seduced to come out to San Francisco and join the .com boom, and was a brand manager for a now defunct .com. But that brought me out to San Francisco and Silicon Valley. And I was able to then go into B2B marketing and use a lot of those skills, first from B2C and then B2B, and really understanding that it doesn't matter whether you sell B2B or B2C, you're selling to human beings. And so it is really all about empathy. And then I went off on my own in 2008 and started my own brand consultancy, Red Slice. And as you mentioned, I've been working with forward-thinking leaders and teams ever since on their brand stories, on their messaging, and now on how to really embrace empathy, not just from a brand perspective, but since brand and culture are two sides of the same coin, helping them on the inside with their leaders and their cultures so that they can be a genuinely empathetic brand and achieve success with their customers and clients.
Okay, that's a good background. Tell us about The Empathy Dilemma. And it's your newest book.
Yeah. It's coming out this fall.
Helpful? Okay.
So the first empathy book, I've written books about branding for small business. I've written, I took a left turn and wrote a memoir about recovering from a near fatal brain aneurysm and getting back into my work and getting back into my business. But the first empathy book I wrote was back in 2019. I had been researching it for 3 years, The Empathy Edge. And that was about how to provide the business case for the ROI of empathy for leaders, for cultures, and for brands. And the data and the research were out there. It just needed to be curated. So that book came out, and then the pandemic hit and lockdown happened. And then all of a sudden, everybody was talking about empathy at work and empathy in leadership. So I'm sad that it took a pandemic to start that conversation, but honestly, the conversation was starting way before then. So this book now that I've been out speaking, doing leadership workshops, doing keynotes, doing ERG talks, this book that's coming out now, The Empathy Dilemma, was really a result of what I was hearing back from leaders. So it was about, hey, we're on board. That, the first book was for the skeptics. This next book is for the converts. We're on board. We want to be a more human-centered leader. We understand how that leads to not only success and morale and productivity, but it leads to better bottom line results. But here's where we're having challenges, especially in a post-pandemic world. So across all my hundreds of interviews, my research, I found 5 common threads for empathetic and effective leaders that they all share. These are 5 foundational pillars that if you shore those up for yourself, you can balance empathy with accountability, empathy with performance without burning yourself out, which I think is the holy grail of a lot of people these days, of how to juggle all these different demands that leaders now have on them.
Tell us about empathy. How do you define empathy, and what's the role it plays in the workplace?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different definitions of empathy, but it's also a word and a concept that has evolved as we've learned more about the brain, as we've learned more from science. And the way I look at it through the lens of being applicable to the workplace is that empathy is about seeing, hearing, and where appropriate, feeling another person's perspective, and further using that information to act with compassion. So compassion is empathy in action. It's what do you do with the information you've gotten about someone's context, about why they feel the way they feel, why they think the way they think. And it's, I try to get away from walking in someone else's shoes because it's still you walking in someone else's shoes. So I much prefer the terminology of seeing things from another person's perspective. Because when you do that as a leader, you uncover more opportunities, you discover more risks you may not have seen, and you see challenges and problems and opportunities in a whole new way because someone else's lived experience gives you a different way to look at that. And so when you look at it in the work context, it's those leaders who have that understanding that their perspective is not the only perspective, and they are willing to listen to and synthesize other perspectives and experiences and thoughts in order to make the best business decisions moving forward. And there's data that prove that empathetic cultures have more innovation, they have better customer rating scores, they have more customer loyalty. It all trickles down into the bottom line. And so when we talk about empathy at work, it's really a mindset and a leadership paradigm of the old ways of command and control and hierarchy and hoarding information just don't work in today's day and age. We require a new type of leader to solve today's business challenges and, quite frankly, world challenges. So when we talk about empathy at work, it's not about being nice to everybody. It's not about crying on the floor with your employees. It's about having the ability to put your ego aside and listen to another perspective. It doesn't mean that you have to necessarily make a different decision or even avoid tough decisions, but it's about how do you get the best from everyone's ideas, engage everyone in the process, and then how do you communicate the decision back to them, even if their perspective wasn't considered or didn't win, right? Their idea didn't win. How do you communicate that back in a way and implement that in a way that everyone still stays engaged and they can still be on board? That's the only way you move the business forward.
Okay, great. Well, this is a big box to talk about. As you know,
Yeah. How much time you
with
got, Steve?
yeah, I know. With our book, Becoming Your Best, the 12 Principles of Highly Successful Leaders, uh, through our research and interviews all over the world of highly successful leaders, what sets them apart from everybody else, including teams, highly effective teams. One of those 12 is to be an effective communicator. And right at the heart of being an effective communicator is empathy. And yet,
Yes.
maybe like you, we've discovered this is one of the most difficult skill sets to build. So tell
hmm
us about the 5 pillars. You just talked about them. What are they, and how do they play
Yeah.
in helping us be more effective to
Well, I
use empathy and yeah.
Yeah, I just want to make a note on what you just said because, our work is so similar in helping people sort of unpack what are these best practices and these secrets to these high performing successful teams. And it was funny researching the second book, really trying to dig into these leaders who were successful and empathetic, but they almost didn't know why. It was so innate to them to just operate in a certain way. I had to really tease it out of them and really try to understand. Now, on the flip side of that, though, something you said sparked this. You can learn to be more empathetic. It is something that is
Mhm.
innate to human beings, but just to some of us, that muscle may have atrophied. But an atrophied muscle is still there. So it's about making a conscious, intentional decision to say, I'm going to be an empathetic leader so I can reap all these rewards. And how do I do that? And that's why in the first empathy book, The Empathy Edge, I gave actionable habits and practices
Hmm.
leaders could use to strengthen their empathy muscle. But the second book, which, as I mentioned, is about the pillars, it's that these 5 ingredients seem to be there. And I bet they overlap a lot with your work. The first one is self awareness, the second is self care, the third is clarity, the fourth is decisiveness, and the fifth, kind of surprisingly, is joy. And when leaders are able to start with self awareness and understand where their blind spots are and where their strengths are, they can determine for themselves which of the 5 pillars they need to shore up in order
Hmm.
to be more successful as an empathetic leader without quality slipping, without them burning themselves out because they're trying to people please all over the place. That's not empathy, that's submission. So, really, when those pillars are present, and in the book, I go into details on the strategies and some actionable tactics for each of those pillars. It's sort of like it's a little buffet. You can pick based on the self-awareness pillar which ones you need to work on and which ones you might want to shore up, or, let your team know that you're working on these things so they can complement you and you can learn together.
How have you found, Maria, that you can spot a leader or a team, an organization, that empathy is a real strength in their culture?
Mhm.
And what are the signs that you see? And you said that there's research that this is driven to the bottom line, actually, in the success of an
Mhm.
organization. I'd love to see what you've observed about that.
Yeah, what a great question. I think a few of them that come to mind offhand are that these are very inclusive cultures. Ideas
Mm,
can come from anywhere. Ideas do come from anywhere. And the leader often has a servant leadership attitude. They do
mm,
not come in saying, I know all the answers and I am going to decide everything, and you minions are just going to execute on everything I do. Those tend to be the cultures where people burn out, where there's high churn, there's high turnover, there's quiet quitting, there's resignation, all those things. So when you have an inclusive culture where good ideas can come from anywhere, you get more innovation, you get more encouraged risk taking, and that helps the company lead in the market. The second marker I see is for lack of a better term, a relaxed atmosphere, a
mm,
levity to the work, even if the work is hard. It doesn't mean the work is enjoyable every second of the day. It just means there's a levity and a camaraderie, which is all about psychological safety and trust, as
mhm,
doing the work you do. And so it's where people can feel free to challenge, to add, to play devil's advocate and to bring ideas forth. And when you have that level of trust and that level of levity, there's more of a kinship, there's more of a camaraderie that takes place, where then when things get tough, and one leader I spoke to in the new book reiterated this, because they've tried so hard to create an atmosphere where they get to know their people and they have levity and they find enjoyment. He said, so when I really have to make a big, painful ask, people trust me because they know I have their back. If I didn't have all of that foundation established, that's when I would get pushback. But now that I've created this foundation, if I have to make a big ask of someone, whether it's extra work, whether it's working late, whether it's doing something Herculean to support a client or customer, they know I'm asking for a reason and they trust me. And I think that that's such an important marker of understanding. If you have all of these different elements, people feel seen, heard, and valued. And they can do their best work in that environment because they know it matters. Because, as you know, people just want to matter even at work.
Mhm. So I love it, and thanks for identifying these markers. And of
Hmm.
course, every day, whether it's one of our associates working with a customer, maybe they have a compliment, maybe they have a complaint or an issue, or it's a sales representative or an outreach person that is trying to, represent their product well, or in
Hmm.
relationships within the office, a leader and a direct report. Empathy is right at the heart of all this, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes we see it, and sometimes it's just crushing because you
Yeah.
don't see it. And
Yeah.
what's your advice to our listeners, to me and our listeners? How can you really take a breath and rather than just start talking, be empathic and listen? And then what
Hmm.
do you do with it once you have it?
Well, I think that's really the important thing, is that it's about listening. Curiosity is the number one trait of empathic people, and it's because you don't guess what someone's perspective or context is. You're asking them, and you're not making assumptions. You're not letting your own biases get in the way about what this person wants to do or doesn't want to do, or what motivates them or doesn't motivate them. You're actually just having the conversation. And what I get from leaders a lot is, well, number one, this is going to take a lot of time. And my answer is yes. And that's why you're a leader. That's the job now, is actually you do need to get to know your people. You do need to understand what motivates them. You do need to be open to their ideas and be understanding of them as a whole person. What do they need to be able to do the work that you need them to do? Because that's ultimately what it's all about. And so, ways that you can strengthen your empathy is just number one is to practice presence. So if you've got too much going on in your own head and you're too focused on self-preservation, you have no room to take on another person's perspective. So you've got to be practicing some mindfulness. And it doesn't have to be yoga and meditation. It could be whatever it is for you that recharges you, that silences your mind a little bit. It could be knitting, it could be exercise, it could be prayer, it could be uh crossword puzzles, whatever it is. For me, it's having a coffee or a tea in the morning without a screen in front of me
Hmm.
to ground me so that I'm not so focused on my own stuff that I can make space to listen and hear. The other is to get really good and focused about asking questions, even when there's conflict. So that the tendency is, I have a conflict with you, Steve. You're my employee and I want you to do something and you don't want to do it. I want to spend all my time telling you why you're wrong and I'm right. But what if I just tried to get to the root of it and got curious and said, I can tell you are bracing against this decision or bracing against this task. Tell me what's going on for you. And then you talk and I say, tell me more. Tell me more are the three magic words. Keep going until you get someone to really explain their context and their mindset. Because now you and I can have the real conversation that we need to have. It might not be about the work, it might be about you're taking care of an elderly parent at home and you're super stressed. It might be you did a project like this in your last job and it failed miserably. And now you're scared. It might be you're not getting along with a colleague that I'm asking you to work with, right? So it could be a host of other things that are not about the thing. So being able to ask questions and be patient and leave space for someone to answer and think through how to explain what's going on for them is just so, so key. And I have to admit, as you can tell, I'm a talker. So for me, it's about activating my inner shusher and just, you're talking too much, Maria. Like, let's hear from Steve and let me, if I know I'm going to talk more, let me ask a question instead of trying to put my opinion and my perspective and my experience on you in the conversation.
Oh, that's great. There's so many really wonderful recommendations, not recommendations, guidelines and ways to do it. And I'll tell you, this has already been worth it for me because you've reminded me that curiosity is the number one trait of empathy.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
it's not about being right or wrong.
No. And
Uh,
it's not about agreeing either. I think that's the other, I spend a lot of time busting myths about empathy. Empathy does
uh-huh.
not mean agreeing with someone. You and I can have a different point of view and a different approach to a business problem or any kind of problem, any kind of issue, right? And it's the goal is connection, not conversion. So we need to both, we both want to solve the problem. We just have different ways of solving it. So I can still say, I don't agree with you, but I understand where you're coming from. So now maybe we can find a third way that benefits both of us. But we can't have that conversation unless we're listening.
Yeah, that's the leadership aspect, isn't it? It's
Mm-hmm.
really difficult as a leader to be able to explore best third options unless you really have a listening culture, an
Right.
understanding culture. And that comes
Right.
from this quality of being empathic.
Absolutely. And I want to add one thing because I know that the thing I always get hit with is, but in the end, if someone doesn't like the decision you're making, if you have to do layoffs, if you have to have budget cuts, if you have to withhold bonuses because of the way the economy's going, those are all business decisions. It doesn't mean you don't make those tough business decisions. When we're talking about being an empathetic leader, we're talking about making those decisions in the context of understanding the impact to your people. And so the way you communicate them might be different if you're actually putting yourself in their position. The way that you answer questions, the way that you make yourself available for support, but it doesn't mean you have to change your mind because if the business decision is the business decision, it's not going to change. One of my most empathetic leaders was someone who had to lay off the entire marketing team. And because he was empathetic, his approach, the way he was prepared to answer all our questions, the way he made referrals and recommendations, the way he's still a mentor to this day, it shows you that you can make those decisions and you don't necessarily change your mind because someone's upset. But it's the approach, it's the mindset that you take that makes you an empathetic leader. So I hear a lot of leaders go, well, if I'm going to be empathetic, people are going to think I'm weak. Empathy actually takes great strength to take on another person's point of view without defensiveness or fear or ego. So just wanted to add that.
All right. Well, and you've said two things also that I love, which is unless you are at peace yourself, unless you have the energy, and you called it mindfulness, you're
Mhm.
in the space, right? It's really hard to be have empathy. And
Mhm.
so it's kind of building a muscle, isn't it? And what are some of the traits or habits you found help people get in that place, a good place where they're thinking all the time, you know what? One of my best tools I have is listening and having
Yeah.
empathy. And so that begins with curiosity. Thanks for the reminder. But I also have to have my own emotional strength, and
Mhm.
especially not only a leader, and not
Mhm.
only when there's a crisis, the pressure's on, but
Right.
also when you're a parent, where you kind of
Same.
get into this mode of tell, tell, tell. But that can happen in leadership too, right?
Yeah. There's so
So
many
how do you?
parallels. There's so many parallels with parenting. Sometimes I hate to bring it up because it kind of sounds patronizing, but you get it. It's very similar. It's about you have a group of people or a person that you're trying to motivate to do something you need them to do, right? And so it's what you're touching on right now is really where that second pillar came from, the self-care pillar. Because
Mm,
if you're running on an empty cup, an empty tank, I mean, think about in your own life. When you're hungry and you're tired, how do you act with other people, right? You are just all about taking care of you. You don't want to hear anything that's going to be difficult. You don't want to take the time. You want to get to your next meal. You want to
mm,
just get your head on the pillow. You're running on a depleted tank. And so when we talk about self-care, we're not talking about manis and petties and massages. We're talking about re-energizing ourselves, getting our brains to think in a different way. So whether, that's why I like to say it could be active or passive. It could be art, it could be sports, it could be exercise, it could be language, it could be knitting, as I said. Any of those activities, figure out for you from the self-awareness piece, what energizes you? What helps you get in a creative space? A lot of leaders I know, and I don't know if this is true for your research, like to do walking meetings because
mm.
walking and moving their body even while they're on the phone or they're on Zoom or they're in person, it it activates something different in their brain, and they're able to it's why we, have our best ideas in the shower. We're doing something else and then bing, the big epiphany comes. That's the same for certain people when they go walking. And so make sure you're finding that time and you're modeling it for your team. I think that's the important piece too, that all the pillars are important for the leader, but it's important for the leader to model the importance of them to their teams so that their team members can practice the same thing and everyone can be running on a full tank when they're interacting with each other.
I was just thinking while you're talking about having a moving meeting
Mhm.
of how powerful, how deep your discussions can be on a hike.
Yes.
Right? There's nothing else out there, and all of a sudden you're getting into it, and you just go deep and having a
Yeah.
meaningful discussion. And empathy also, as it becomes a culture, as it becomes a habit. And I love the fact you said it's a mindset. I want to come
Mhm.
back and ask one more question on that. But it also has another powerful impact, is it builds trust. It builds
Yes.
trust within your organization. It creates an environment that we've been talking about that's far more effective, that's
Mhm.
far more innovative than not having that type of communication.
100%. There's studies, many, I'm not going to cite a specific one, around what happens to our cognitive and abilities and our executive functions when we're under stress.
Mm,
They don't work well because we are in self-preservation mode. So extrapolate that out to a business environment or a workplace culture where people are fearful, they're stressed, they're tired, they're watching their backs all the time. They're worried the next time the boss is going to come out and yell at everybody. Are they really at their sharpest focus? No. I mean, science says no, your brain cannot work to its best cognitive ability that way. And so I like to challenge leaders to say, is that really what you want? Is that really the culture? You want a bunch of people who are not thinking at their full capacity. I don't
mm.
think that's what you want because you want your bonus next year, right? you you want to make your numbers, you want to hit your KPIs, you want to do all the things. And so creating an environment, it's not coddling. I get that a lot, like, well, that's just coddling everybody. It's not.
Ah,
It's brain science.
how true. Now,
Yeah.
you mentioned one thing earlier, and it's about the mindset.
Mhm.
So, what have you learned? What have you discovered, Maria, to help you have the right mindset that helps you get into the skill set?
Oh, I love this
So you
question.
get it done. Okay.
I love it because I might be an empathy expert, but I'm not an expert on empathy. And you can just ask my husband and my 10-year-old. So I am constantly practicing. And I think that's the important lesson is this isn't necessarily something we want to believe this is something that will just come naturally for us. And for some of us, it doesn't. And also because, again, our stress levels, our health levels, our sleep levels ebb and flow every day.
Mhm,
So we're going to be at different capacities for empathy, no
mhm,
matter what. And I think two of the biggest things I've discovered that I have to, I admit, I'm like everybody else, I don't always put them into practice. Number one is taking a pause, taking a beat when things get tense, when I feel the triggers in my body, right? It's being really aware of what's happening in your body when you get agitated,
mhm,
when you feel confronted, when you feel challenged. Recognize the signs in your body. Is it your face feels flushed? Is it your hands start to sweat? Is it you start to feel like you want to interrupt somebody at every moment? Recognize those triggers. Stop the conversation and take a few deep breaths. Because when you have that pause, it re-engages your cognitive abilities. It puts your cognitive abilities back online, is how I like to think of it. And
mm.
so the moments when I've had the presence to do that, especially with my son, it's a better outcome. It's a
Yeah.
better conversation. In the moments where I didn't, like just last night, it's a horrible outcome, right? That we're still dealing with the fallout from this morning. Everyone's mad, right? So that's number one is that power of the pause. And I've learned that from a lot of my podcast guests. The other is to practice self empathy. And by that, I mean kind of what I was alluding to earlier. You're not going to be perfect every time, and it's going to feel forced. It might feel awkward at first, especially if you didn't grow up in a very empathetic environment or your workplace is not very empathetic. It's going to feel strange and weird, but keep going back to the empathy gym and working that muscle, and you might be sore and that's okay. But have some compassion and forgiveness for yourself, because you can make it right the next time. You can have another chance. You can repair that relationship. There's always that opportunity.
Well, I have loved our visit today. Can
Me
you
too.
believe we're at the end of the interview already? It's been
I
30 minutes. That's how
I
long
know,
we go.
crazy, crazy.
Oh, it's been a delight. Thanks for all the helpful ideas and the emphasis and how powerful this is in
Thank
human
you.
relations and in leadership and having winning teams and organizations. It does make a big difference.
Mhm.
So how can people find out about what you're doing?
Well, they can check out my main website, red-slice.com. They can check out the new book. It's available for pre-sale right now, but it comes out September 10th, The Empathy Dilemma. It's available in all the places. And I would love for folks to connect with me on Instagram at Red Slice Maria, or on LinkedIn, Maria J. Ross. But if they connect with me on LinkedIn, they have to tell me they heard me on Steve's show.
Okay. All right. Well, it's been a delight, and we wish you the best in all that you're doing. You're doing a great work.
Thank you. I wish you the best too. Thank you for your work in the world as well.
It's a pleasure. And to all of our guests, thank you for joining us today. This has been chock full of a lot of good ideas that really make a difference. So thank you, and we wish you all the best. This is Steve Schallenberger signing off, your host. Goodbye.